But welcome, everyone. Welcome to GraphQL Europe. I hope you're all super excited. I'm super excited to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. I also see a ton of new ones. This is the second GraphQL Europe conference. And did you know that we have double the number of people here this year than we had last year? That's crazy. That's crazy. So for those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Byron, and I'll be your master of ceremonies for the day. And if we met last year, then you might have noticed that something about me is different this year. That's right, I got new glasses. Thanks for noticing, thanks for noticing. No, but last year I forgot to wear my bow tie, and I got a lot of talk back for that. So I decided this year I wouldn't forget my bow tie. Didn't forget. So I spend my time building technology and tools and teams to help people build great products. And I spent the last 10 years doing just that at Facebook, where I helped create a bunch of open source projects that I'm super proud of, including, of course, GraphQL. Though a couple of months ago, I left my job at Facebook and joined Robinhood to help lead their web engineering team. And they're driven by a mission that I believe in, which is to democratize access to the financial system. And they got a ton of super interesting product and technical problems that I was super interested to help them solve. And they also use and contribute to a ton of open source projects, including a ton from my teams at Facebook, including React and Immutable.js and Yarn and Flow and many others. So if anything in there sounds interesting to you, I'm trying to find people to help me on this next mission. So please don't be shy, reach out. But of course, I'm still involved with GraphQL as the editor of the spec. And I wanted to open things up today with a little bit of an update. That's right, it's time for the state of the graph. And where best to start than the beginning? 6 years ago, in 2012, Nick Schrock, Dan Shaffer, and I, we built the first version of GraphQL to solve a set of API problems that we faced while rebuilding Facebook's iOS app. We saw that our apps were writing a ton of manual code to run the right API requests in the right order and then munge all those results together into the format that they expected. We saw feature development slow because every significant change required an API change first, and often that also meant new API versions. Documentation was sparse, and we often missed really important edge case details, like if a value could be null or not, or what happens if there's an error. And finally, if anything goes wrong, we didn't really have great tools to debug and learn what was going on. So GraphQL lets apps decide the shape of their API responses, reducing the need for all this manual reassembly code. And by growing instead of versioning, APIs and app development can happen in parallel without breaking each other. And GraphQL provides a strong type system, which lets us programmatically check for mistakes and ensures that our documentation is always up to date, because we're not writing that manually anymore. It's derived. And beyond good docs and graphical, there's now a wide range of pretty awesome tools for using GraphQL, thanks mainly in part to a lot of you in the room today. And since then, GraphQL has not only become a critical part of how apps were built at Facebook, but thanks to releasing a technical preview 3 years ago, in July 2015, it's also brought together this community, and it's gotten to become a tool in your belt as well. And so Nick and Dan and I, and along with some of our coworkers, we actually evaluated every detail of GraphQL. We made improvements, we fixed inconsistencies, and we ultimately produced a specification that described GraphQL and how it works, as well as a reference implementation in JavaScript. And what followed was a veritable explosion of activity, which honestly was kind of a challenge to keep up with. It still is. Many companies, especially smaller startups, began to dip their toes into the GraphQL waters, and even a handful of bigger companies started to put their vocal support behind it, like GitHub. And all of this activity helped our technical preview spec go through kind of a hardening phase where we responded to feedback, we cleaned up ambiguities, and the result of that was the first official release in September 2016, no longer just a technical preview. And along with that, we launched GraphQL.org, and GraphQL started to feel like a real thing, like a stable open source effort. And that brought us to the first GraphQL Europe conference, this time last year. We convened in this very same place to discuss the future of GraphQL. And I presented a plan then to build a stable base atop which this community can continue to explore. And I explained the RFC process, and we talked about GraphQL subscriptions going through that process. And since then, we've actually been able to use this for lots of other additional improvements as well. And I introduced what I called the GraphQL Working Group, which is this sort of ever-rotating group of people that meets once every 1 to 2 months to talk about the RFCs, open issues, and any other relevant topics. And actually, we just had a successful working group meeting yesterday. And if you're curious how that went, or any of the previous ones went, you can see all the agendas and the notes from those meetings on GitHub, because our working group sessions are open by nature. We don't have like a locked, you have to pass some gatekeeper to get into those. And so that brings us to today. Here we all are. Earlier this week, the latest version of the spec was released, actually the first time in almost a year and a half. And it's the highest quality yet, a direct result of that RFC and working group process over the last year. And this is a big one. It includes a lot of stuff that we've been talking about, like the type system definition language. We often call that the SDL. GraphQL subscriptions is in there, error paths. These are just 3 of dozens of major changes in that new version of the spec. All of these were designed and discussed with the community first. And this conference actually marks a really important moment in GraphQL's history, because we started the GraphQL project in 2012. And then about 3 years later, we open sourced the spec and the reference implementation. And today, GraphQL has been open source for about 3 years. So that means at this point, GraphQL has been open source for just the same amount of time that it wasn't, which I think is pretty cool. So I'm really proud of this community and everything that we've built together, because GraphQL is now much, much bigger than it ever could have been if we had kept it within Facebook alone. In fact, I was so surprised by how well that initial open sourcing went that I actually wrote down a prediction of what I thought would happen next, along with some just super rough dates for what I considered a best case scenario. I call it my GraphQL secret master plan for world domination. And I think I've presented this before, but I think it's interesting to get a little bit of an update. For the first few months, I was excited when my predictions seemed like they were becoming pretty accurate. I saw personal projects and hobbyists starting to join the GraphQL community and starting to build interesting things. And then we sped down the list. I thought it would take 2 years to see GraphQL implemented in 10 languages. But in well under a year, we had over a dozen different programming languages with GraphQL libraries built for them. And today, most of those are being used in production by real companies. And last year, I put up a large list of companies, or a list of large companies, rather, who are using GraphQL actively to show this progress towards broad adoption. And this year, I didn't even bother to try to fit them on slides, because I would just be up here like listing through companies. It's totally crazy. And I'm not sure exactly what ubiquity means, but we seem to be on our way. GraphQL is a first-class offering from AWS. That's a big deal, right? There's multiple companies built up to provide GraphQL tools. And not only are there multiple annual GraphQL conferences and dozens, if not hundreds, of meetups, but GraphQL is now a topic at general case developer conferences as well. So in just a few years, GraphQL has gone from a tool that we use at Facebook to an important part of the overall developer community. And watching it grow has been deeply satisfying and super exciting to see. So today we're going to get a look to see what that growth looks like. We're going to see wisdom from companies adopting GraphQL, interesting new tools and projects, and some new ideas that might just help us rethink established best practices.